right, so try number 2. We are talking about, we're on assignment 1 for module 6 here, RSH900. The objectives of this participation are to discuss the institutional review board, and specifically their research on human subjects. Discuss the research protocol that goes along with this, and the instrumentation that you would utilize to do these studies, and then discuss the sample selection and the consent and getting consent from different populations, that kind of stuff. So the Institutional Review Board, this is the board that they review all research studies, known as the IRB. So if I say IRB, that's what I'm talking about. There's really 3 different categories that the Institutional Review Board uses when they're reviewing research studies. The first one is exempt status, and then expedited review and full IRB review. So exempt status, this would mean that your research study involves none or very minimal risk to participants, all the above, physically, emotionally, physiologically, and economically. So it would have no or minimal risk in all of those categories. And then you may be exempt from review, so they say, yep, you're good to go. Expedited review, it sounds like it's faster, but that's not exactly what that means. It just means, so these don't meet the criteria for exempt status. There may be minimal risk, and maybe not no risk, but minimal risk. And these can be reviewed by one member of the board, and it doesn't have to get a full board meeting together to do this. So it's a little bit faster, expedited versus the full review, but it's not as fast as exempt. And then you have the full IRB review, which is reviewed by the entire board. They have a meeting. They have to discuss whether or not they're going to approve your research study. This is very common if your research study involves experimental drugs, if it's going to be a very stressful psychological setting for the participants, or if you're using vulnerable populations, which I will get into later, what that looks like. And then we have approval of research on human subjects. So this obviously needs approval from the IRB. There's no way you're going to be able to do this and have your studies go without and ethically continue without approval from the IRB. Their primary concern in any of these is going to be the human subject's welfare. So they don't care as much about, hey, what are you going to find out from your study, as much as like what's going to happen to your participants. Are they going to be safe? Is there going to be something that happens to them in a negative effect? And then not only that, but you're going to look at the risk versus the benefit. So what is the risk to your participants, and what are they benefiting out of this, or what is society benefiting out of? Is it really worth whatever risk you're putting them into? If it's a really, really high-risk situation, there better be a real risk. Like if these are all terminally ill cancer patients and they're willing to take the chance because it may be their only chance of survival, maybe you have a chance with an experimental drug, that kind of thing. All right, so the protocol for using human participants in your research studies. The first thing is that they're going to look at is what is the aim of your research? What are you looking to do to figure out what's your hypothesis that you're studying, and why? And so that's the research rationale. Why are you studying this? Why do you think this is an important thing to figure out for the betterment of humanity, or at least of that population? What is that population that your participant pool is? Is that a vulnerable population? Once again, I'll explain what that is later. And what's the design of your study, and what methods you're using? And do those make sense for what your aim and your rationale are? And if they don't make sense, then you're not probably going to get it approved, because they want something that makes sense as a study that's going to help people and a few further researchers. And then, are you giving incentives to these people? And if you are giving incentives, is that going to bias your study, or how big are these incentives? What's the reasoning behind the incentives? So that's one thing they'll look at as well. Big one for human subjects: privacy and confidentiality. Obviously, anything that the subjects do during your study, you're going to want to keep private. You're not going to be able to want to trace back to a particular individual in your study. Keep it confidential, especially if you end up using vulnerable populations. As I talked about earlier, the risks and the benefits. So what is the risks that the participants will have from participating in your study, and then what are the benefits for them specifically, but also for humanity? That's a big one. All right, so like your sample selection, how are we going to pick who participates in our study? So there's 2 different types. Sampling is like the drawing of of elements, or in this case, people from a population to obtain a sample. So obviously you can't sample all 8 billion people in the world. So how are we going to sample a selection of them and make it work and be reliable? There's 2 different types. There's a random sample or a non-random sample. Random sampling would be, if you have in my case, a high school. So you have 2,000 kids in your high school. You have them all listed. You have numbers 1 through 2,000. You use a random number generator to pick out 500 different people of them, and that's who you're sampling. So you have absolutely no say as a researcher. Everyone's involved. You just randomly pick some. Non-random sampling would be if the researchers had a criteria or protocol they were using to pick certain participants and place them in certain groups. As you can imagine, this can cause some biased samples, some biased data to come out. And there are times where you would use this, but if you can use a random sample, it produces a much more generalized sample, so you could generalize it to the population as a whole. And researchers would be able to conduct your study and hopefully come out with the same outcomes more often. Power on here. So power is really the strength of your study. Like, how strong is this study? And this is going to go up incrementally as your sample size increases. So if you have 10 people in your sample size, it's going to be a much weaker study than if you have 1,000 people in your sample size. Why is this? Well, if you pick 10 people, maybe you randomly just pick the 10 smartest people in the school. But if you pick 1,000 of the 2,000, you have a pretty good chance to have a good mix of all different types of people in that school. All right. Consent. So you have to get consent from everybody that's ever going to be involved in your studies. First thing you need to give instructions. What is this study going to be about? What are they going to do in this study? It needs to be very detailed. It needs to be easy for them to understand, and with wording they can understand. So language that they use. If it's a 10-year-old, it needs to be written in language that 10-year-old at their reading level. If it's college kids, you can do it at their reading level, but you need to make it sure that they can understand it. You need to be really cognizant of the scheduling and make sure that your participants know, am I going to have to come back 3 times? Is it going to be, 2 months long? Am I going to have to be blah, 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 doing certain things, and you have to make sure that they're able to be there for all of what you need. And then you have to get informed consent. So consent saying, yeah, I'm okay with doing this. But informed consent means you've explained everything about it to them and they're still okay with doing this. So you have to get this from every participant in the study. If they're adults, you just have to have them fill out a consent form and sign it. That explains the entirety of this. However, if you're working with some vulnerable populations like children, you need to obtain informed consent from the legal guardian, but you also, if they're 7 or older, you need to get assent, which would mean that you explain to them what they're partaking in, that it's a study, you talk to them in their language that they can understand, and that they say verbally, like, yes, I'm okay with doing this study. Mentally impaired, if they're at the level of a child, to do the same thing you would with a child. However, if they're not able to communicate in that way, you still need to get full legal guardian informed consent in order to participate in a study. Once again, this consent form, you would have them fill out a consent form, sign off that they understand that we've walked through the instructions and what it's going to entail. Vulnerable populations. So this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a good amount. So people with non-curable illnesses, like if you had terminal cancer, that would be a vulnerable population. Residents in nursing homes who can't fend for themselves, be independent. Incarcerated peoples who don't really have a choice in where they're at. Impoverished, like severely impoverished, poor communities. Unemployed students, both students that are minors and students at the college level, homeless peoples, refugees who are here under refugee status from other countries, racial minorities, pregnant and nursing mothers, mentally ill people. All these would fall into the vulnerable population, and there's really stringent rules on that. And you can really only research these people if it's important for their health, either personally or as a group, and they're unable to be performed on these studies with other participants and get the results you want. So if you can do a similar study on a non-vulnerable population and get results that can be generalized to this population, then you really need to do it on the non-vulnerable population. All right, so research protocols. So you have reliability, which is the consistency of the measurement you're using. How consistent would other researchers be able to do this and use this measurement and get consistent results? The validity of your research. There's construct and content validity, face validity, content validity. So really, how valid are your results going to be? How valid is your study as a whole, and can this be replicated over and over and over? And are the results valid because they weren't biased? That kind of thing. So there's different instrumentations that you can use. I work at a school, so I'm going to kind of go with which school ones would be. So orally would be interviews. So if you're talking with students and staff one-on-one, that kind of thing. Observational instrumentation would be usually participant observation. So you'd be sitting there watching behaviors of certain groups of students or a focus group of students and watching what they do. Collecting data technologically through online test scores or written data and self-reports, Likert scales of like highly agree, disagree, that kind of thing. Using questionnaires, needs assessments, that kind of stuff. And then these are my references. Thank you for listening to my